He currently co-chairs the Inter-Academy Partnerships Working Group on Climate Change and Health, and is also co-chairing the Lancet Pathfinder Commission on Health in the Zero Carbon Economy. He has published many papers on topics such as effects on environmental change on health and the health co-benefits of low-carbon policies. His current research focuses on climate change mitigation, sustainable healthy food systems, and complex urban systems for sustainability. Don't forget, for all the students, don't forget to take notes, because as you know that after, with your tutors, you're going to debrief the conference, and that's very important to see exactly what kind of takeaway you can write down on your note from the talk we're going to have. Sir Andrew Haines, thank you very much for being with us this morning, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk in your Imagination Week. It's really a great honor and privilege to be able to do that. What I'm going to talk about is some of the work we've been doing over recent years, including the work of this commission, which I chaired a few years back, the Commission on Planetary Health for the Rockefeller Foundation and the Lancet Medical Journal. And if you want to look at that to get more detail, you can download it from the Lancet website. Just find it on Google and it downloads an open access publication. But the message really from this report was that this concept of planetary health is essentially an acknowledgement, a recognition that our health as human beings ultimately depends on the health of the natural systems. So we defined it very simply as the health of human civilization and the state of natural systems on which that health depends. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is just to really give you an overview of some of the dramatic changes that have been occurring over recent decades. On the left, you can see the socioeconomic trends. World population has gone up to about 7.5 billion people. We've seen a large increase in gross domestic product and economic, as a result of economic growth, lifting many people out of poverty. The number of people in absolute poverty, of course, has declined, although still far too many poor people. And of course, in many parts of the world, increasing inequalities. This has all been accompanied by a dramatic increase in energy use, most of it generated by burning fossil fuels, in fresh water use, in the damming of rivers. So we've dammed about 60% of the rivers. We've also increased transport, land, air, shipping has all increased in order to generate the kind of economic growth that's been perceived to be required for human development. So in many ways, humanity has improved over recent decades. Of course, there's still a long way to go, and all the fruits of those benefits have not been shared equally. But this progress has also come at a tremendous cost. And the cost, of course, has been borne by the Earth's systems. So we've seen an accumulation of carbon dioxide, which is a long-lived greenhouse gas, trapping heat in the Earth's atmosphere. About 20% of that stays up in the atmosphere for 1,000 years or more. Temperatures have increased. The average temperature has increased by about 1 degree. We've seen a really large decline in tropical forests with an accompanying loss of biodiversity. Some people have said we're now in the 6th mass extinction of species. And of course, we've domesticated a lot of land in order to grow food for this growing world population. So the take-home message is, yes, there's been great human progress, inequitable, but there has been great human progress. But that's depended on the exploitation of the Earth systems. And that cannot continue because by exploiting, damaging those Earth systems, we can undermine the progress that we've seen over recent decades, centuries. Next slide. So this is just one of those changes, climate change, and you can see that a number of different temperature records actually, all showing the same thing. So there's no doubt that climate is changing. And there's no real doubt at all that it's due to human activities, to carbon dioxide, as I've mentioned, but also the short-lived greenhouse gases like methane, contaminants like black carbon, and others. So what we've seen then is about a 1 degree increase since the temperature records began, since the pre-industrial times. That's been higher over land than over the oceans, because the oceans help to cool the temperature, but that's a global average shown in this graph. And you can see that there are fluctuations, as you would expect. There are periods when the temperature doesn't increase so much, around the Second World War, for example. And then there are times when it really takes off quite dramatically, and we're in that phase now, when many of the hottest years on record have occurred within the last 10 years or so. So next slide, please. This just shows you some of the risks associated with climate change. So as the global temperature increases, you get increasing risks, as shown on this slide, a whole diversity of risks. Ecosystems can't change fast enough to keep pace with the temperature change. Extreme weather events increase, like floods, storms, droughts. There's the potential for ice sheet collapse. Coral reefs die off. And of course, the Arctic region is suffering more than most, because this warming, this heating is not a uniform process. As I've said, it's more over the land than the oceans, but it's also increased closer to the North Pole. So you can see on the left side of this slide, you can see how temperatures are increasing in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly as a result of climate change. And we're seeing dramatic changes, of course, in the Arctic region. And this is bringing many other consequences with it, of course, including effects on health, on crops, on coastal flooding, and a range of other outcomes. Next slide, please. So where are we headed? Well, this slide gives you really two futures. The bottom line, the sort of purpley blue line, is what would happen if we could really cut greenhouse gas emissions quickly. The top line is what will happen if we just let greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase. And that will take us to about a 4 degree heating compared with pre-industrial times by the end of the century. So that would be a rate of heating that's humanity, indeed the planet, really has never experienced. It's really very far outside any of the natural variability of the climate. And the bottom line shows you that we can still keep within 2 degrees, which is what was aimed for in the Paris Climate Agreement, of course, was 2 degrees, and if possible, 1.5 degrees. Well, we're already just over 1. It's going to be almost impossible to keep to 1.5. So where are we heading now? We're somewhere between these two lines. So if all the commitments included in the Paris Agreement are implemented, then we will have a temperature increase of around about 3.2 degrees by the end of the century, something like that. So that's, again, far outside our comfort zone and far above what the Paris Agreement was really focused on. And so that puts, obviously, us and future generations at great increased risk. Next slide. But of course, it's not just climate change. Climate change is just one of these changes that I've talked about earlier. Johan Rockström and Will Steffen and colleagues have advanced this idea, this theory, that there are planetary boundaries. So we live on a small planet, and there are certain boundaries within which we have to live in order to safeguard the future of humanity. And if we go outside those boundaries, then we put ourselves at increased risk. And this slide just summarizes some of those boundaries. Some of them are a bit controversial still, but some of them I think are pretty well established. I've mentioned biosphere. We're seeing a dramatic decline in biodiversity, as I've said, 100-fold greater, probably 1,000-fold greater actually, than pre-human times. Climate change I already mentioned. We're pushing up against the climate boundary, as you can see from the slide. Phosphorus and nitrogen, we're putting far too much phosphorus and nitrogen into the environment in order to grow food, often very inefficiently for the growing world population. And of course, we're seeing transformation of land systems to grow more food. Deforestation is proceeding, particularly in places like the Amazon and so on, at a very rapid speed. So there are many reasons why we should be concerned about the trends in these natural systems, which are summarized in this slide. And this just emphasizes the fact that there are finite limits within which our human civilization has to live and to flourish. And the crucial thing now is to find policies which will keep us within these planetary boundaries in a safe way. Next slide, please. So this next slide just summarizes the potential impacts of one of these changes, that's climate change, on human health. And of course, each of these changes I've mentioned in the previous, or shown on the previous slide, could have a range of direct and indirect effects on health, some of them better understood than others. So this is the climate change summary. And what you can see is that through these different mechanisms, rising temperatures, increasing carbon dioxide levels, extreme weather, rising sea levels, because as you heat the oceans, of course, they rise, can cause a whole range of health effects. How bad these health effects are will depend on how we respond, whether we're able to cut greenhouse gas emissions to keep within the 2-degree boundary that we should keep within, and whether we're able to support and sustain particularly the poorest and most vulnerable members of our society. Here are the various impacts. I won't go through them all, but you can see there's a very diverse range of effects of climate change on health, ranging from the familiar infectious diseases like dengue and others, where the changing mosquito vector distributions can change the distribution of these diseases, to the heat-related illness. That's obvious. As you heat the atmosphere, you get more heat-related illness, death rates, particularly amongst the elderly, increase. Then we got, of course, effects on crop yields and nutrition, and of course, of extreme events, injuries, fatalities, and very importantly, the effects on mental health, which I'll say a few words about later on. And then there's a category in the lower part of the slide, which is much more difficult to quantify, but likely to be very important, which is about forced migration, civil conflict, and these range of indirect social and economic effects. How many people will die? Well, it depends on the decisions that we make. It depends how well we can adapt. There will be limits to adaptation, of course. Many populations, if you live on a small island, you can't adapt so easily. If you live in a coastal region, you can't adapt so easily. And it depends how quickly we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So this is just to illustrate one of the effects on heat, labor productivity. So on the left side, you see how increasing heat has decreased global physical labor capacity. So the important thing is here, when you heat the atmosphere, particularly in tropical and subtropical regions, where people are already living at the limits, fairly close to the limits, the heat limits or thermal limits of what's feasible to do with heavy manual labor, then of course, as you heat the atmosphere, that becomes labor, work becomes more difficult, particularly if you're working in the open air, outdoors, without any shade. And you can see the estimated decline there. And on the right side, you can see a map from a paper of ours of a couple of years ago, which shows you how extreme heat exposure in the hottest month of the year expands to cover an increasing proportion of the land area of the planet as we heat it. And as we reach about 2.5 degrees centigrade heating of our pre-industrial, then about 1 billion people will be exposed to such extreme heat that they won't be able to work in the summer months. So they'll have to take shade, they'll have obviously risks to their health, and this will disrupt their lives and push more people back into poverty. So next slide, please. But of course, crops are also vital for human health, for our nutrition. And on the top, you can see the impacts of climate change on the productivity of food crops in 2050. The red areas where we're going to see most probably big declines in crop yield. And the green is where we might see an increase, but we don't know how long that increase will go on. You can see in the Northern Hemisphere. And we don't know whether people living in crop areas where crops are declining will be able to afford to buy food on the open market. And at the bottom, you see the global hunger index, and you see that there's quite a big overlap between those countries that are currently experiencing hunger and those which are going to suffer increasing declines in crops with climate change. So that's going to increase the concerns about undernutrition. Next slide. And this slide just shows you how undernutrition, well, hunger has increased in recent years. It's it to go down, but because of population growth and probably also climate change, it's starting to go up again now in recent years. So that does suggest that already we're turning the point, and the number of hungry people is increasing, particularly, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, but also other parts of the world as well. And that will be magnified by conflict, as we can see on the slide, in a number of these countries. But also, of course, COVID is proving a major challenge to food supply distribution systems. Next slide. And so this isn't just the effects of climate, there's also the effects on nutrition of carbon dioxide. So when you put lots of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it stimulates the growth of crops. Some people have said that's a good thing, but they don't take into account the fact that these crops do grow slightly more when you put more CO2 in the atmosphere, but the level of nutrients in those crops declines. And the slide shows you that that declining level of nutrients. So some of these nutrients are quite important for human health. So Fe is iron, of course. Zn is zinc. Both iron and zinc, of course, very important for human health. And many people suffer micronutrient deficiencies. So this carbon dioxide fertilization effect could actually increase undernutrition, even if it somewhat stimulates crop growth. And there's a lot of debate as to how long that will go on. Next slide, please. And this also shows us about fruit and vegetables, because most of the work's been done on staple crops, like the grains and rice and so on. But actually, from a health point of view, fruit and vegetables, legumes, nuts, seeds, they're all very important for human health. And they reduce the risk of many of the common non-communicable diseases like heart disease, some types of cancer and so on. And you can see from some work that we've been doing that these environmental changes, decreasing fresh water availability, increasing temperature, increasing salination, all reduce the yields of these crops. CO2 may increase it somewhat, but as we've already said, the level of nutrients is likely to be lower. So overall, negative effects on fruit and vegetables, legumes and others, nuts, which will also have an impact on human health. Next slide. But the food system also has a big impact on the environment. So this slide just summarizes some of the effects of the food that we eat on the environment. Now, most greenhouse gases, of course, come from the burning of fossil fuels, but food systems are also an important driver of greenhouse gas emissions. And those emissions are shown on this slide. It shows you the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents, so it includes CO2 and methane, for each different type of food group. You can see beef has the highest footprint. That's because of methane production, of course, and some extent land conversion. Lamb and mutton somewhat less, cheese a bit less. Dairy herds somewhat less than that, but still very high. And all the plant-based sources of food, of course, are much, much lower than the animal sources, because there's an inherent inefficiency as well. Not only do ruminants produce methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, crops to animals, there's quite a lot of inefficiency in converting those crops into protein or into calories for human consumption. So you can see that there are big differences in the carbon footprint of different food groups. Next slide, please. And this also shows you water stress by country, showing that many parts of the world are experiencing increasingly water stress. So that's not just due to climate change, that's also due to the fact that countries' populations are depleting the fresh water at a very rapid rate. So the Arab world, for example, has decreased its per capita freshwater supply by about 3/4 over the last half a century or so. So these are sources of water which are buried underground. They can't be replaced. They've accumulated over millennia and they can't be replaced. So that's an added problem on top of climate change, and also means we need to think not just about the greenhouse gas emissions of our crops, but also the water footprint of our food, because most of that water goes for irrigation to grow food, to grow crops. Next slide. And unfortunately, the fisheries are also declining. This slide shows you the decline in fisheries over recent decades. You can see there was a peak around just before 2000, but since then have been declining. And most of the increase we're seeing now is actually due to aquaculture, not due to wild fisheries, which are declining because they're being overfished, also because of climate and other environmental changes. So we can't look to the oceans to make up that shortfall from the land. Next slide. And of course, sea level itself could, the rising sea level could affect over 1 billion people by mid-century, because many cities are on the coast. Not only are these changes in the oceans affecting our food supply, but they're also endangering many of our coastal cities, which will find it difficult to adapt. Next slide. And of course, there's effects, as I mentioned before, not just on physical health, but also mental health. So there's this concept called solastalgia. Solastalgia has been defined by Glenn Albrecht and colleagues as the distress caused by environmental change. So when people see their environment changing around them, whether it's the wildfires in California destroying the forests that are familiar to people, or drought affecting Australian farmers, or floods in South Asia, these can cause dramatic changes in the environment, a loss of familiar environmental features. And this can cause, according to our colleagues in mental health, mental ill health. And we also know that temperature actually has an effect on suicide rates, possibly a direct effect, possibly indirect effects as well. But there are these relationships between the climate and our mental health. Next slide. Of course, we're now seeing at the moment in California these wildfires, which the intensity of which, not necessarily caused by climate change, but the intensity of them increases because of climate change. This is just another example, the fires of the Indonesian fires of a few years ago. They were actually due to El Nino, which is a natural climate phenomenon, although it may be amplified by climate change. And the air pollution, particularly bad from those fires because they burn the peat, which is very full of particles. The smoke is full of particles, which of course is very damaging to human health. But we're also seeing very large amounts of air pollution from the Brazilian Amazon and also from California. And the slide also shows the daily emissions from the Indonesian fires. At the time, there were actually more greenhouse gases being emitted than from the US economy. Next slide. So even here in Europe, we can see that climate and other environmental change are affecting infectious diseases, shown on this slide from colleagues at the European Centre on Disease Control. And you can see that many of these changing infections, including infections like dengue, for example, but many others, are related to changes in the natural environment, including the climate. So there's increasing evidence that many of these diseases, their transmission is being affected by climate and other environmental changes. Next slide. So we're becoming increasingly aware that many of the changes in land use due to our desire to grow more food, changes in the food industry are driving some of these recently emerging infectious diseases in humans from wildlife. Of course, we know that COVID probably came from bats, of our relationship with nature. So lots that we still don't understand, but there is increasing evidence that these emerging infectious diseases, many of them are zoonotic, that come from animals, are related to our food systems, the way in which we're exploiting the natural world. Next slide, please. So having given you the bad news, let me finish by trying to give you a more positive picture as to what can be done. And I think it's particularly timely. The theme really of your studies are about imagination, because in the Planetary Health Commission, we identified three broad challenges. First of all was the imagination challenge, or conceptual challenge. One of those examples of those is the fact we tend to conceptualize human progress as being solely related to economic growth, as summarized in GDP. And most politicians focus on GDP growth as their main focus of their policy. But GDP is a very poor reflection of human progress. And of course, you can increase the GDP by having an environmental disaster and then cleaning up after that environmental disaster, and that could stimulate the economy. So we need to reconceptualize these metrics, these indicators of human progress, to focus much more on human well-being, but also the important metrics of sustainability of natural systems on which we all of us depend. The second challenge that we identified was a knowledge challenge. We have a lot of knowledge, but we often don't have the right knowledge. So we don't have transdisciplinary knowledge. We all tend to work in our own little boxes or in little silos. And actually what we need to do is to collaborate across disciplines. All disciplines have an important contribution to make, and we need to understand each other's languages. I don't mean necessarily French, English, Spanish, whatever, Hindi, but I mean also the language of different disciplines, the way in which they approach different problems. And thirdly, we have a big implementation challenge. So even when we know what to do, we often don't do it. And there are powerful reasons for that, including, of course, major vested interests. So let me quickly, in my concluding remarks, go through some of the potential solutions. I'll go through them quite quickly, but we can cover them in the discussion. Next slide. So the important point to make is that we don't have very long to stay below 2 degrees. And if you follow that middle line, 2-degree line, the 50% line around, you come to the number of 28.4. So we have about 30 years of current emissions left if we want to stay within the 2-degree guardrail of temperature increase. So we're emitting greenhouse gases at far too high a rate even now, and COVID probably won't affect that very much. Next slide. So what can we do about climate change? Well, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot of inefficiencies in our energy systems. We know that many of the things we need to do will benefit our health as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's doing a lot of work on the London School with our colleagues around the world. So clean energy means less air pollution, sustainable food systems and healthy diets means healthier diet, better health, but also reduced environmental impact. And sustainable transport systems can also improve human health through greater physical activity. Next slide. So this just shows you what's been happening with COVID. And you can see that fossil fuel CO2 emissions did drop quite dramatically, particularly in April, but they're bouncing back very quickly as lockdowns are reduced. And of course, because much of our economy is powered by fossil fuels. So we can't look to COVID to reduce our emissions. In the long term, a recent paper has shown those emission reductions will have virtually no effect on global temperature. And so we actually, when we're coming out of COVID, we need to put in place policies that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, secure health, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve equity, as well as stimulating the economy. Next slide, please. And there's a lot of public support for this. Recent opinion polls, this is the Ipsos polls of nearly 30,000 adults, actually done in April, but it showed that a high proportion of the public support the idea of a low carbon economic recovery. In France, it's over 60%, UK, it's nearly 60%, even in the US, it's nearly 60%. So a lot of support for a climate friendly and presumably healthy as well economic recovery. Next slide. But unfortunately, that's not really happening. Most of the investments are just investments into industries which require fossil fuels for their functioning. We know that fossil fuel subsidies are about 400 billion annually worldwide. They exceed the subsidies for renewables. Only about 13% of emissions are covered by carbon pricing. But clean energy prices are generally quite competitive. So the auction price for solar photovoltaic is lower than the marginal operating cost of coal-fired plants. The concern is, of course, that we're seeing very low oil prices. And so where you have extremely low oil prices, then it does become more difficult to compete, particularly if the subsidies continue. We also know that setting prices at fully efficient levels would lower carbon CO2 emissions by about 30% and reduce fossil fuel air pollution deaths. So we need to avoid bailouts of different industries that could be damaging for health and the environment. Some countries are doing that, but a recent analysis suggests only 4% of the stimulus funds are actually low carbon or green investments. About 4% are active investments in fossil fuels, and the others are just investments in business as usual, which is largely fossil fuel powered. Next slide. So lots we can do as companies recapitalize. You need to include not just the economic criteria, but also integrating environmental and health criteria. And as I've mentioned, many of the investment packages up to now don't fulfill those criteria. So a lot of firms will need an equity injection, and this could be an opportunity to redirect them down to a zero carbon economic trajectory. At the moment, I don't think it's likely that that will happen to a sufficient degree, but it's something we should continue to strive for. Next slide. This just shows you the benefits of putting more money into decarbonizing the economy. So it's a paper last year from colleagues in the Max Planck in Germany, and it's a map of air pollution reductions in deaths. At the top is what would happen if we could take out all the fossil fuels from the world economy. The dark brown is where you get the big health benefits, and you can see over China, India, Europe, United States, because we burn a lot of fossil fuels, you would get big reductions in fossil fuel related air pollution deaths if we decarbonize the economy. So that's an added motivation to do so, not just protect the climate, but also to reduce air pollution deaths. And the bottom part of the slide is other sources of pollution, which I won't go into. Next slide. So, of course, the future of planetary health will depend considerably on cities. They're the engines of economic growth and economic activity, probably about 80% of it or so, and 3/4 of the global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. On the left, you have Atlanta in Georgia, in the US. On the right, Barcelona. The difference between the two, they have the same population roughly, but you can see Atlanta's much, much bigger. And the transport-related carbon emissions in Atlanta are about 7 times greater than that in Barcelona. That's because, of course, you've got to use your private car to get around Atlanta, whereas in Barcelona you can use public transport, at least prior to COVID. But you can also, of course, use walking and cycling in a much more compact city. So the way in which we design our cities will have a big impact on the environmental footprint of the city, but also the health of the population, because we know that the best way to get exercise is through walking and cycling, the most natural way in your day-to-day life. Next slide. Many cities then moving towards a long-term development plan which goes towards a circular economy with renewable energy, sustainable transport, using waste as a resource, not throwing things away, but they're a tremendous resource in terms of raw materials and energy, healthy food, valuable water, recycling water, and creating sustainable and livable communities, fostering a sense of belonging, living in a neighborhood where you feel valued as a human being and secure. And these are 6 policies which are central, I think, to establishing more sustainable communities. Next slide. We can see that sustainable mobility trends are scaling up. We don't know what effect COVID will have on that. It's going to be a bit of a blow to public transport for the next couple of years, but hopefully when we get a vaccine, everything will return back to the pre-COVID normality, and there'll be an expansion of public transport. But there has been an opportunity to increase cycling and walking. We have seen that in a number of cities, and some of those are making that permanent. So there may be benefits as well. Next slide. This is just some work we did some years ago, looking at if we could get the whole of urban England and Wales walking and cycling like the population of Copenhagen in Denmark, which, as you know, is probably the most cycle and walking friendly city that we know of. And this slide actually shows you the benefits or the savings to our National Health Service if we could get them all walking and cycling like the people of Copenhagen. You can see that the benefits from reduced diabetes, from reduced heart disease, dementia, some types of cancer, would accumulate over 20 years. We estimated about 20 billion euros, something of that order, but going up over that 20-year period as a result of more walking and cycling. Next slide, please. And of course, the effect of green space is also a positive one. Many physical and emotional benefits from exposure to green space, and the slide illustrates some of those. I don't know if you can see the right side of the slide, but what it shows you is that exposure to green space reduces our displeasurable moods, reduces anxiety and anger, and increases pleasurable moods. So there are mental health and physical health benefits. Next slide. And also planting trees can be beneficial to health, depending on which trees we plant, whether they're allergenic or not. But they can overall reduce the urban heat island and potentially also influence pollution levels. So green space and tree planting can be beneficial if that's done carefully. Next slide. And housing as well. Don't have time to go into detail, but we've done quite a lot of work on healthy and sustainable housing, including the benefits of retrofitting. the old housing stock. We have a lot of obsolete housing stock. I live in one myself in the UK. But if we were able to retrofit those to make them more efficient, better ventilation, but better insulation as well, then we could save large numbers of deaths per year from indoor air pollution, from cold, as well as saving a large amount of greenhouse gases. And the picture just shows you the difference between a thermal imaging camera of a modernized house and an unmodernized house. Next slide, please. And then the food system itself, dietary change. A lot can be done by reducing food waste and food loss. About 30% of the world's land is used to produce food that's never eaten. And by promoting healthy, sustainable diets, particularly eating more fruit, vegetables, nuts and seeds, less animal-based products, particularly those related to ruminants, of course, like cattle and so on. Next slide. And this diet has been advanced by the Lancet Eat Planetary Health Commission. It's not the one that I chair, but another one that should come more recently. And they propose this diet, which if it were adopted globally, could by the middle of the century be preventing perhaps 10 million premature deaths a year. It's around 20% of adult deaths a year, according to their calculations, maybe a bit optimistic. But they proposed this diet, which was more fruit and vegetable, as I suggested, more whole grain carbohydrates. They suggested animal source protein should be a very small part of the diet, and dairy as well. But we also need to eat plenty of plant protein, very little sugar, and not so much starchy vegetables. So this was just a broad global sort of guideline. Obviously, it needs to be adapted for different cultures and so on. And the big problem at the moment is it's not affordable. So many people can't afford to eat the adequate levels of fruit and vegetables. Next slide. And then there's, then of course, there's future foods I don't really have time to go into, but it's an area of great innovation right now. Future foods, including mycoproteins, cultured meat, at the moment quite energy intensive, but some of the others are quite low energy. Some of these insects, for example, 2 billion people already eat insects, but there's also a lot of insects that can be fed to animals and to fish. So there may be a lot of developments, a lot of innovation in the food sector at the moment, looking at healthy foods which have a much lower environmental impact. We may be able to come to that in the discussion. Next slide. And then, of course, redesigning the energy water food nexus to make energy use much more efficient, less burning of open fires, the use of LPG or solar in houses as far as possible, and much more efficient irrigation to grow more crops with less water. Next slide. And then nature-based solutions, a lot of interest in nature at the moment, how we've undervalued nature, how by forest conservation we can reduce disease risks, reduce air pollution, reduce malaria, reduce other infections. Restoring ecosystems can regulate fresh water, protect us against flooding, for example, through wetlands and mangroves. So a lot of interest right now in nature-based solutions, how they can improve health, environmental sustainability. Next slide. And the health system itself, which is quite a major emitter, about 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the health system. And there's a lot of work on decarbonizing the health system, particularly working with pharmaceutical and medical equipment industries to decarbonize the supply chains, which are a major source of the emissions. Next slide. And then finally, we need to move towards the circular economy. So the circularity of materials is inevitable, really, to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement, because production of only 4 materials would fill the remaining carbon budget by 2100. So we need to make sure that we move towards a circular economy, so more reuse, recycling, remanufacturing, sharing of goods, rather than just new primary production. And that will be absolutely essential to meet the Paris targets. Next slide. So One Planet Living, the healthy circular economy, which helps us to make much more efficient use of our existing resources, but in a way which also minimizes our exposure to pollutants. That's going to be an important focus for future innovation, imagination. It's the way to go for the future. But that will mean that we need an economy which is designed much more around the sharing of essential goods, reuse, repair, and remanufacturing of goods. Next slide. So we need disruptive change which triggers very rapid change. And this slide just shows you the Easter parade on Fifth Avenue in 1900. You can see it was all horses. 13 years later, replaced by cars. Cars are now part of the problem, of course, because they're also emitting so many fossil fuels. So we need another disruption, a planetary health disruption, illustrated by this image on the right here, which will take us, transform our economy towards a zero carbon economy within a period of relatively few years. And we can debate how we can achieve that. Next slide. So finally, in conclusion, why aren't we moving more quickly? Well, there are a number of barriers to policy change. There are major vested interests. There's this very interesting book, Merchants of Doubt, which I recommend to you, which shows us how vested interests have been blocking progress, particularly in the US for many years. They've been funding so-called think tanks that put out climate change denial. They try to obscure the truth on a whole range of issues, including on the harms done by tobacco and so on. So these vested interests are creating a lot of misinformation, and they are partly, largely probably responsible for some of the political polarization of climate change in countries like the US. We have divided public opinion and perception that change is expensive and difficult. And so against that background, the good news message that a low carbon economy would improve health in the near term and can also stimulate innovation and new types of economic initiatives, I think is a welcome one and one that needs to be emphasized. Next slide. So let me conclude then just by saying, well, solutions do lie within reach. I mean, there's a lot we can do with the imagination, and you're talking about this, I know in your course, which is great. We said they should be based on the redefinition of prosperity, to focus on the enhancement of life and the delivery of improved health for all, together with respect for the integrity of natural systems that we've tended to take for granted. I've run out of time, so I'm going to stop there. But thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Andrew Haines. Unfortunately, we cannot give you a big hand from everybody. I will do just on behalf of the students. Thank you very much. I received a lot of questions, actually, because we have a WhatsApp group with all the students. I would say we have three different type of questions. We have a question related to COVID-19 and to what extent actually it could have so many relation or not between climate change and new virus. And to what, because it's not on the slide, the slide you mentioned that some healthcare issue we can have since we're going to have so many climate change, but it didn't mention, this slide didn't mention virus or new virus. To what extent we can have so many new virus due to the climate change?
Yes, that's an important question. I don't think that COVID-19 was due to climate change. I don't think that climate change will necessarily cause new viruses. I think what's more important is probably the relationship with the natural world. So when we disturb, when we go into forests, or when we have food systems in which wild animals come into close contact with domestic animals, for example, that can increase the transmission of viruses. So it's not the climate necessarily directly causing this, but it's probably the altered relationship between natural systems and human societies, which are triggering many of these emerging viral diseases, often called zoonotic diseases because they come from animals. So that's, I think, the fundamental reason for this. And so it is linked to things like land use change, but also the changes in food systems, where, for example, in Malaysia some years ago, we had an outbreak of Nipah virus, and that was probably due to the fact that bats were living in close location with domestic pigs. They transmitted the infection to the pigs and then to humans. So that just gives you an idea that it's because of the disruption that we're causing through the way in which we, our food systems, but also exploitation of forests, deforestation, and so on could also be playing a role in that.
Thank you. We have another question, two questions actually, they're very close. It looks like the agreements on climate change, such as like Agenda 21, Kyoto, COP21, are always ineffective to really make a change. If politics failed, how can, as individuals, take action to ensure a better future for the next generation or for this generation, actually?
Yeah, well, this is a crucial question. I mean, there are things we can do as individuals, and we should do them. I mean, we can buy our energy from zero carbon suppliers in most countries. We can modify our diets to eat less products that have a higher environmental footprint. We can be more conscious of what we're eating, eat a healthy diet with more plant-based foods, for example. We can also use our bicycles or walk if we live in cities, for example, rather than always using the. So there's a lot we can do in our private lives. And that, of course, will have impacts on our circle of friends and family and so on. And we believe also that health professionals can have a big effect by amplifying some of those messages. But I think more importantly, we can do a lot as members of organizations, professional groups, for example, some cases activist organizations, but also through the private sector. We do see some companies taking a lead on this, decarbonizing their supply chains, working towards much more sustainable business models. So I think those of you who are going to go into business need to think about how your creativity in business can also stimulate the kind of rapid transition, the disruptive transition that we need towards a zero carbon, more sustainable economy. And as I hinted at, I didn't have time to go into detail, but there are a lot of innovative ideas out there in the food system, for example, how we can transform foods, make them much lower environmental footprint, but also healthy foods. But there are also innovations in many sectors, energy efficiency, renewable energies, and so on. So there's a lot that can be done through innovative and creative private sector initiatives. But of course, we do need the government to set the right regulations. You know, you've got to have carbon pricing, you've got to have the right regulations in order to stimulate and support some of that innovation.
Does it mean that you trust individual more than government or institutions?
I wouldn't say that. I think it's very diverse. You know, we've seen some governments have been very proactive. You know, we've seen some outstanding governments. The New Zealand government, for example, has been very successful over COVID. It's also reorienting its economy towards what they're calling a well-being economy. So they stop focusing on economic growth for its own sake, and they're focusing very much on the improvement of human well-being, human health, as well as obviously reducing damage to natural systems. So some governments are being very far-sighted and very progressive. Some are being less so. You know, obviously the Trump administration at the moment in the States is a problem, and it's relying on misinformation to confuse the American public and so on. But even in the US, we see a lot of support for decarbonization strategies. So I think it isn't just one or the other. We need to put pressure on governments. We need to act as individuals, and we need to act as citizens.
Yeah, because there is a question related to this point: to what extent it is compatible with democracy, and actually more democracy you will have, and they are looking for the next term, the next election, you know, and they don't be focused on a very long term. And it's not really popular, actually, to take so many very drastic policy. And to what extent it will be compatible?
Well, that's a very important question, because we don't know the answer to that at the moment. But I do believe that one of the problems with democracy at the moment is misinformation, as we know, and that people are being deliberately fed information which is designed to confuse and to mislead them. So we do need to tackle that much more effectively, including through work in schools, work in and higher education institutions about how we recognize misinformation and how we tackle it. But I think overall, I think it's going to be very difficult to impose these kind of changes on people. Ultimately, it has to be because people see that it's in their near and long-term best interest that they support these kind of initiatives. And we've seen that in the opinion polls, you know, that I showed you very briefly. There is now majority support for a zero carbon transition as we come out of COVID. But I think the problem we have at the moment is in many countries, politicians are very much in the hands of powerful interests. And those powerful interests are often, of course, are dominated by people who've made their money in fossil fuels. And so they are lobbying against some of the changes that need to occur. And we see that in some of the European countries, for example, Poland, for example, which is going much more slowly than many other countries to decarbonize. But we see it in other countries as well. So I think it's an ongoing struggle. There isn't an easy answer to it. I don't believe the answer is to go back on democracy. I believe the answer is to make democracy function better, to tackle misinformation, and to educate citizens better and to empower them more. But I think already we can see that the majority of citizens are in favour of the right action. And as I've indicated, many of those actions will produce benefits in the near term. So it's not just about future generations that will benefit. We will benefit from reduced air pollution, better health, and so on.
So to stick on this point, what is your, because that was one of the questions among others, but yeah, so many questions about it. It's what is your opinion about, because as you know that there is a lot of debate, not only in France, but not just in France, about nuclear power, nuclear plants, nuclear powers, and to what extent we should find an equilibrium, to what extent we should definitely stop it. What is your opinion about it?
Yeah, this is a complicated area because there are risks and benefits from nuclear power. And in fact, France does have lower greenhouse gas emissions per capita than many other countries, thanks to its nuclear power program. The problem with nuclear power is, of course, that we haven't seen the expansion of nuclear power in recent years for many reasons. It's proved difficult and expensive to construct nuclear power stations, and nobody's quite worked out what to do with all the nuclear waste and so on. So I see nuclear power as a transitional approach in some economies. But if you look overall, the way we have to go is using renewable energy, because we know that there's plenty of energy out there, solar energy, wind energy, but we're not exploiting it sufficiently. So really the focus has to be on scaling up very rapidly renewable energy, particularly solar, but also wind in some countries, perhaps wave, and maybe we already have quite a lot of hydroelectric, but that also has its own problems. So solar, wind are probably, undoubtedly the best and most promising technologies. So nuclear may have a small role and has a role in some countries, but until we can solve the problem of expense and nuclear waste, it will be very difficult to scale up and to compete with renewables, with solar.
Thank you. And maybe to conclude, there are a bunch of questions regarding the pandemic and regarding the COVID-19 and more specifically about the vaccine. And there is so many questions about it, such as what do you think about the vaccine, which is not really well tested? It's just reading some question, really well tested or not enough tested. What is your point of view about it versus, for instance, a systemic immunity effect on the population? So do you have any idea, thought about this kind of next couple of months?
Yeah, well, this whole idea of what's called herd immunity, population immunity, of course, that takes a long time to establish that. So probably we would need about 60% of the population to be immune. But I don't think herd immunity will happen in the end, I guess, because this virus will continue to be transmitted in the population, and hopefully we will have a vaccine in coming years. I think we have to be very cautious about releasing an unproven vaccine to the whole population. That would be quite dangerous, because if it then turns out to be either ineffective or to have side effects because it hasn't been properly evaluated, then that will set the whole cause of a vaccine back a long way. And we know that there's already a very powerful vaccine anti-vax movement. Again, a lot of it based on misinformation. But if vaccines are released, which are not very effective and have some side effects, then that will just empower the anti-vaxxers. And so it'd be extremely dangerous. We need to do the proper trials. And that means doing trials, proper randomized trials, where you have randomly allocate people to have the vaccine or a control vaccine in large populations, including large numbers of vulnerable people, to make sure that they are indeed protected. The evidence we have at the moment is that antibodies probably do confer protection, but it's not just antibodies, it's also what's called cell-mediated immunity. So there are different immune systems in the body, and the cell-mediated immunity is probably also important for COVID. So there is an immune response. We don't know how it's for. Many people think that we'll have to have regular, if it works, which I think it will. If it does, then we'll have to have regular immunization, perhaps once a year or whatever. We don't know. It's possible there will be separate strains, just like there are with flu. So every year, many of us have an annual influenza injection, and that changes from year to year because the different strains change from year to year. So it's quite possible that COVID will be something like that. We'll need to have annual or regular vaccinations. But it's really important that the studies are done properly and not released prematurely for political reasons, like Trump is threatening to do in the US, for example, which I think could be very damaging.
Thank you very much, Professor Andrew Haines. That was again great honor, great privilege to welcome you. Thank you very much. Lots of inspiration for our students. Now the students will work on their side with their tutors. Just a message for the students, you have to be on your Zoom link with your tutors at precisely 10:15. So 10:15 you need to be connected with your tutor Zoom link. Thank you again, Sir Andrew Haines. That was a great pleasure to listening your thought about it. Take care of you, and I hope to see you physically within the next couple of months. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.